Hey, you guys. Gary Jenkins back here in studio of Gangland Wire. Y'all know me. I'm a retired Kansas City Police Intelligence Unit detective and now podcaster and documentary filmmaker. I have in the studio today Geoff Kelly. He's a now retired FBI agent. He was an expert in recovering stolen artifacts and art pieces. He was involved, he wasn't involved in the original theft of the Boston art theft, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, but he ended up inheriting that case. So welcome, Geoff.
Hi, thanks, Gary. Nice to be here.
And guys, I need to mention this right off the bat. Geoff has a book, 13 Perfect Fugitives, the true story of the mob, murder, and the world's largest art heist. Be out on Amazon. I'll have links down below in the show notes if you want to get that book. I think it would be pretty interesting. I was telling Geoff, I just interviewed the Joe Ford, the $1 million detective, the guy that goes after classic cars, and I read that book. I love these kind of caper kind of books and caper crimes. Those are the ones I like the best, is the caper crimes. And Geoff is an expert at working caper crimes, and that's what these are, is capers. So, Geoff, how did you get into this? Now, you came on the FBI. You were a policeman before, I believe. So tell the guys a little bit about yourself and your FBI career.
Yeah, I started out with the Metropolitan Transportation Authority Police in New York City. It was a transit cop. I did that for 3 years, and then I got into the FBI in October of '95. And my goal was always I wanted to work violent crime. That's what drew me to law enforcement in the first place, working bank robberies and kidnappings and fugitives. I had to do my 5 years on working economic crime, telemarketing fraud. It was interesting, but not all that exciting. And I finally in 2000, I got my transfer to the Violent Crime Squad, and I loved working it, and I did it for my entire career from then on, right up until my retirement in 2024. But back then, art theft was considered a major theft violation, and it was worked by the Violent Crime Squad. And so, in 2002, my supervisor dumped this old moribund cold case in my lap. It was the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. And nobody wanted it on the squad. So they figured, let's give it to the new guy. And I was ecstatic to get it because I'd heard about it. I went to school in Boston. I went to Boston University and graduated the year before it happened, but I knew about it. And so that's how I started working this particular case. And then the following year, during the the U.S. and coalition forces invaded Baghdad in Iraq. And during a 36-hour period, more than 15,000 objects of very, very important cultural history were looted from the National Museum of Iraq. And it's really one of the most important museums in the world in terms of our shared history.
Kind of the cradle of civilization over there in the Tigris Euphrates River.
Yeah. And that was the time when the FBI kind of belatedly realized that there was no art crime team to investigate this. And of course, FBI agents have been working art theft like any other property crime since the beginning of the FBI's existence, but there was no codified team. So they did a canvas for the team in 2004, and I applied for it because at this point I'd been working the Gardner case for a couple of years and really was fascinated by it and made the team. And so then over the next 20 years, we continued to expand the team, both in size and in scope and in our intelligence base and knowledge base. And when I left the Bureau in 2024, it was and still is a tremendous team with a lot of very dedicated and professional agents and professional support.
Yeah. Now, guys, if you don't know about the Isabella Stewart Gardner case, there was a Netflix documentary on it a few years ago. It was a art museum in Boston. Two guys showed up. They had Boston police uniforms on, and they got in. It was an armed robbery, and they took control of the museum. The guards that were in there late at night and took these really valuable paintings out. I believe you told me earlier they were Rembrandt paintings. We'll get into that. And it was a violent crime. It was an armed robbery of paintings, and you told me about other armed robberies of paintings. I think you got into some other armed robberies of paintings. You always think of, as you mentioned before, the Thomas Crown Affair character that goes out and does these sophisticated art thefts. That's not always true, is it?
It's never that way, but that doesn't matter. Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story. And
Yeah.
Everybody wants to believe that art thefts are pulled off by the Thomas Crown affairs and these gentlemen thieves who rappel in through skylights and do all that fancy stuff to put it in their underground lair. That's just not the way it works. But if you look to art theft, Massachusetts really is a cradle of art theft in this country, and it's very unique. The first armed robbery of a museum occurred in Boston in 1972. It was committed by a guy named Al Munday, who was a prolific art thief. And they stole 4 pieces from the Worcester Art Museum in central Massachusetts with a gun. They ended up shooting the guard. And one of the pieces that they stole was a Rembrandt called St. Bartholomew. And in keeping with the milieu of true art thieves, the paintings were stored on a pig farm just over the state line in Rhode Island. And when this Connecticut safecracker by the name of Chucky Carlo, who was looking at some serious time in prison for some of the crimes that he committed, when he found out that Al Munday had these paintings, he just simply kidnapped Al Munday and stuck a gun in his ribs and said he would kill him if he didn't give him the paintings. There's no honor among thieves. And Al turned over the paintings. Chucky returned them, and he got a very significant break on his pending jail sentence. Right here in 1972, Boston thieves see Rembrandt as a valuable get out of jail free card. And then if we jump forward 3 years to 1975, there was a very skilled art thief, really a master thief by the name of Miles Connor. I interviewed Miles for my book. It was very gracious of him to sit down with me for it. And he had robbed or committed a burglary of the Woolworth estate up in Maine, the family, the five and dime family magnates. And he got caught for it because he tried to sell those paintings to an undercover FBI agent. And so he was looking at 12 years in prison for it. And he was out on bail. And he reached out to a family friend who was a state trooper. And he asked him, how can I get away with this one? How can I get out of this? Because he was in serious trouble. The trooper's response was meant to be hyperbolic. The trooper said, Miles, it's going to take you a Rembrandt to get out of this one. And so Miles said, okay, I'll go get a Rembrandt. And he got a crew together, and they did a daylight smash and grab at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, just across the street from the Gardner. And they stole Rembrandt, a girl in a gold-trimmed cloak. And he was able to return that painting. Instead of doing 12 years, he did 28 months. And he told me he even managed to get the $10,000 reward in the process. And so you have this atmosphere in Massachusetts that Rembrandts are a valuable commodity, right? They can help you out in a jam. And so I think it's no coincidence that in 1990, when the Gardner Museum heist came down, the Gardner Museum had this array of motion sensors all throughout the museum. It would alert wherever you went, every gallery, hallway, whatever. And we know from these motion sensors that after, as you said, the 2 guys went in disguised as cops and bluffed their way into the museum, they made a beeline for the Dutch room, which is the room of all things Rembrandt.
Yeah.
They stole 3 Rembrandts. They stole a 4th piece called Landscape with an Obelisk, which was actually by Govart Flink, but it had been misattributed to Rembrandt until the mid-'80s. And then they took a large Rembrandt oil on panel off the wall, and it was recovered the next morning leaning against a piece of furniture. And we believe they just overlooked it in the dark. So out of the 13 pieces taken, 3 were Rembrandt, a 4th was misattributed to Rembrandt, and there was going to be a 14th piece taken, which was also Rembrandt. It definitely falls into that theory that this was going to be a hold on to these pieces for a while and see if you can use them for a break.
Interesting. Back in the 70s, for example, when somebody would work an art robbery like that or an art theft, you got your tried and true ways of working a crime. You got to have sources, you got to have witnesses, and hopefully you can get a crime like this. You can get a source that says, "Hey, this guy." We had a guy in Kansas City that he was a fence for these kinds of guys. He had an antique auction, and he took all this stuff and got it somewhere else. So you at the time just use your regular police methods. And what changed over the years as you've done this?
Yeah, certainly we've become much more sophisticated with the techniques that we use, but it's at the end of the day, it's always still going to be intelligence. But I found from working my entire career in violent crime, virtually my whole career in violent crime, the sources are crucial. Having a good informant can make and break a case. And working art theft investigations, you're certainly going to have the same types of fences of informants, fences for stolen property and what they're hearing about what organized crime guys are doing and what drugs guys are doing. But it also opened up a whole new avenue of sources for me as working in art investigations, because now you've got pawn shops and gallery owners and auction houses, and they're in a position to know when, not only when stolen artwork is coming in, but also fakes and forgeries. We spoke about this, that somebody comes in with one valuable piece that would be very difficult for somebody in his or her position to have to come across one piece like this,
Yeah.
let alone a dozen of them. But that really points to probably a fake. And so that's really the key to solving these things, is just having a good intelligence base who's gonna let us know about when something comes up that's either stolen or it's been forged.
Hmm. Brings up a question in my mind. Did you ever work a gallery owner or a gallery that then would knowingly filter in some fakes every once in a while? They couldn't do it 100% of the time, but you could certainly make some extra money by filtering fakes out of it, because
Oh
many
yeah.
people would get it and they'd never know. Nobody would ever know.
Listen, it is a really difficult thing when you're working these types of crimes, because unlike bank robbery, you go into a bank and you stick them up with a gun and take the
Yeah.
money. It's not up to the government to be able to prove at trial that you knew that the bank was insured by the FDIC. You went in and you robbed it, you
Yeah.
committed the offense. When you're talking about interstate transportation of stolen property or possession of stolen property, they're what's called specific intent crimes, meaning you have to prove the element of knowledge. You have to be able to prove that the person knew that that item was stolen. Not just that it was stolen, you had to show that they knew it. And that's a really high hurdle to overcome. And typically what we do to try and prove that specific intent is we're going to go through recorded statements made to a source or to an undercover, or emails or texts or something that we can show that this person knew that item was stolen. And so we would see that a lot in auction houses and galleries. There's a lot of willful blindness where
I
a
bet.
lot of gallery owners and auction houses, they're going to look the other way because it's too lucrative to pass up. And in fact, in 2015, the art crime team, once we received information that ISIL or ISIS was using looted cultural property from Syria and Iraq as a viable form of terrorism financing. And we
Mm.
put auction houses and gallery owners on notice in 2015. And we basically told them that if you're selling objects of cultural patrimony or cultural heritage with a dubious provenance, like a wink and a nod, you may be unwittingly or wittingly funding terrorism. While we never charged anybody with it, hopefully it was an eye opener that when you're getting into this world, it's not just it's not a victimless crime. There are very real victims involved. And so that's one of the things that really is interesting about working art crime investigations. And I used to get ribbed by my friends who were not on the art crime team about
Yeah.
we're like the wine and cheese squad, wearing
Jeez.
berets and everything. But our subjects are far from it. We're dealing with organized crime,
Yeah.
gangs, terrorists. These This is no joke. These are
Yeah.
serious individuals, and the stakes are high. And
Yeah,
when you look
really.
at the Gardner case, 3 or 4 people that we believe were involved in the heist were murdered the year after the Gardner case crime occurred. And
Yeah, I was just gonna go back to that a little bit, as we said before, a little bit like the Lufthansa case. All of a sudden, everybody that was involved in the theft started dropping like flies. So tell the guys about that.
yeah,
That is really interesting.
yeah. So the 2 individuals that we believe went into the museum dressed as cops, just a week shy of the 1 year anniversary, one of the guys was found dead in his apartment of an acute overdose of cocaine intravenous, and his family admitted that he used coke, but they said he was terrified of needles. He was scared of
Mhm.
needles. So it really looked to be like a hot shot, an intentional overdose of cocaine. 2 weeks later, the other guy who we believe went into the museum with him, his wife reported him missing. And a couple of weeks later, his bullet riddled body was recovered in the trunk of his car out by Logan Airport in East Boston. There was another member of that crew. These were all part of the same crew. This Carmelo Merlino, who was a Boston mobster, had an auto shop down in the Dorchester section of Boston. Another member of his crew, a guy named Bobby, 6 weeks after the heist, he visited a jeweler in the downtown Crossing jewelry district in Boston. He came in with this object and he unwrapped it. It was a eagle. It was the finial from the Napoleonic flag that was stolen in the Gardner heist. And he asked the jeweler, "How much is this thing worth?" And the jeweler looked at it and he said, "It's worth nothing," because he immediately recognized it as one of the
Yeah.
people that had been stolen 6 weeks earlier from the Gardner heist. And then a few months later, Bobby was stabbed to death and nearly decapitated on the front porch of his house. And the responding police saw that his house had been broken into and ransacked, like his killers had been looking for something. There was a fourth guy, Jimmy, who bragged to his girlfriend in February bragged to his girlfriend a few months after the heist that he had a couple of pieces from the Gardner Museum hidden in his attic. And in February of 1990, 11 months after the heist, he was executed on his front porch in what the local police called a mob hit. So, yeah, these are the types of crimes that have a tendency to have a chilling effect on anybody who harbors any aspirations to come forward with information.
Yeah, and we talked earlier a little bit about, like, uh, the crime itself, and the statute of limitations is up on that from what you said, and the
Yeah.
crime itself, but how we talked a little bit and explained to him about how this could be part of a RICO case, and you've got the murders, and you've got the actual theft and whatever they did with the paintings, then maybe you could after a mob boss as a RICO case. Tell the guys a little bit about doing that.
Yeah, that's I've heard it so many times in the more than 2 decades that I worked the case, and people would say, "Geez, why don't people come forward? They're just paintings." And I
Yeah,
hear that so many times. They're just paintings. And I'm like, yeah, they are, but there's two things about that. Number one, there's some dead bodies on these paintings, three
yeah,
or four, and there's no statute of limitations for murder. And so if you implicate yourself in the theft or you implicate yourself in possessing or transporting these paintings at any time, the fear is that you're then implicating yourself in a homicide. And the other aspect of this, which I think has a chilling effect, is the fact that transportation of stolen property is one of the predicate acts for a RICO, racketeering influence corrupt organization case. And RICO is basically, Gary, is basically an entire organization is corrupt.
yeah.
There's no legitimate purpose it's what we think about the mob, and the FBI has taken down the mob in the past. So if you implicate yourself in stolen property and you're part of organized crime, that's one of the predicate acts for a RICO, and that's basically life sentences. And so one of my goals in the years and years that I worked at this case was to try and convince people that you could come forward with information, and the U.S. attorney's offices, whether it's up in Boston or New Haven or Philadelphia, would be willing to figure out a way to get the paintings back, and with immunity from prosecution for a RICO case. But then that's a high hurdle. That's a high
Yeah.
hurdle to convince somebody that if you come forward, you're not going to get charged
Mm.
and you're eligible for millions of dollars in reward. That's a tough pill to swallow, but it's the truth. I'm retired from the FBI now. I can tell you that it was and still is a bona fide offer, and
Mm.
that's one of the goals that I've always tried to impress on anyone, is the opportunity to become a millionaire without going to jail. If you have any,
There you go, Jeff. Now you're not with the Bureau anymore. Can you go out? If you could go out and find them and bring them in, could you collect that reward?
I would certainly hope so. I can't tell you how many of my friends thought that I had some of these paintings stashed in my basement,
Yeah.
waiting for retirement to go turn them in the next day. I think that half the guys I worked with are expecting to see me pull into the parking lot of the FBI the day after I retired. A big package, but no. But yeah, I suppose I could. But by this point, I can tell you with the amount of my my very being that I put into this case over 2 decades.
Yeah.
I just would love to see these paintings go back, just because they need to be back at the museum. That's where they belong.
Yeah. Now these crimes, they seem. You said there's a lot of murders attached to this. They seem a little boring. Did you have any exciting moments trying to pop anybody or do any surveillances? I know we did a big surveillance of a bunch of junkies that were going around stealing from small museums around the Midwest, and we follow them here in Kansas City. And they would have been pretty exciting had we had a confrontation with them. Did you have any exciting moments in this?
It actually was a fascinating case, and for the first, there's the really boring aspects of this job and
Yeah.
tedious aspects. And I would say that in my 2 decades working this case, I probably did, I don't know, 50, 60, 70 consent searches, searching in attics and
Wow.
basements and crawling through crawl spaces and just getting sweaty and covered in cobwebs. But the break in the case for me came in 2009 when one of the guys who was part of Merlino's crew, who was deceased, his niece came forward to me and told me that the paintings, some of them had been hidden up in this guy's hide at his house up in Maine. I went up to Maine with Anthony Amori, who's the director of security for the Gardner Museum. We worked on this case together for years. And we found that hide. And then we interviewed, right from there, we went and interviewed Guarenti. That's the guy, Bobby Guarenti. We interviewed his widow. And she broke down and admitted that he once showed her the paintings and she gave them to a guy down in Connecticut. And we identified that guy and we interviewed him. A guy named
Wow.
Bobby Gentile. He's a made member of the Philly mob. He got straightened out with his crew back in the late 90s. And he refused to cooperate. And then that's where we really just started using a lot of ingenuity to try and break it. And an agent down in the New Haven office, a guy by the name of Jamie Lawton, he joined our team and we started working this case. And he had a source who knew Bobby Gentile, and the source started buying drugs from Gentile.
There we go.
Yeah. We ended up arresting Gentile and we did a search warrant at his house. And it was crazy. Like, we recovered, I want to say, 7 handguns, loaded handguns lying all over the place. He had a pump action shotgun hanging by the front door. He had high explosives. We had to evacuate the house and call in the bomb squad. But the interesting thing was he had the March 19th, 1990 edition of the Boston Herald with headlines about the Gardner heist. And tucked inside that newspaper was a handwritten list of all the stolen items with what looked like their black market values. This is in the house of a guy who swore up and down that he'd never heard of the Gardner Museum.
Yeah.
And we were able to figure out who wrote the list. It was written by none other than Al Munday, who's the guy that did the first armed robbery of a museum, of a Rembrandt. And we interviewed him, and he told us that he wrote that list for Bobby Gentile and his buddy up in Maine, Bobby Guarenti, and because they had a buyer for the paintings and they wanted to know what they were worth. So, yeah, and then Gentile took 30 months. He wouldn't cooperate. And while he was incarcerated, we turned 2 of his closest friends to becoming sources. And so when he got out of prison in February or April of 2014, they started talking to him and talked about the Gardner, and they said they might know somebody who'd want to buy them. And that's how we then introduced an undercover agent. And Gentile was introduced to Tony, this undercover FBI agent. And over 6 months, they had long talks about selling the paintings. Unfortunately, before Gentile would sell the paintings, he wanted to do a drug deal first, which we couldn't allow to happen. Can't let drugs walk on the street. So we had to take it down. And although we seized all these guns from Gentile back in 2012, he told the sources the FBI didn't get all of his guns. Because of that disturbing comment, one of the sources asked Gentile if he could buy a gun from him, and Gentile sold him a loaded 38. So we arrested him again, and he still refused to cooperate. I don't respect what he did for a living or a lot of the things that he did, but you do have to respect his adherence to his values, however misguided they may have been. He took the code of omerta, the code of silence, to heart, and he took it to his grave. He died, I think, in 2021 after going to prison a second time. While we never got any paintings back, it was a tremendous ride, and I'm confident they will come back. It's just going to be a question of when.
Yeah, that's kind of brings up the question that you hear people speculate. Did you ever run across this? Is there actually any rich old guys or an Arab sheik or somebody that buys stuff like this and then really keeps it and never shows it to anybody? Does that unicorn really exist?
Everybody wants that to be true.
I know.
Fortunately, it's not. Yeah, there's never been a case of some wealthy, what we call the Dr. No theory, some reclusive billionaire with his underground lair filled with all the illicit stolen treasures of the world.
Yeah.
It's never happened.
Yeah.
I guess you never say never, but no, look, the majority, statistically, about 3/4 of everyone that collects art in this country does it for, and I assume it's probably worldwide, does it for the investment potential. There's a lot of money to be made
Yeah.
in collecting art. It rarely, if ever, drops in value. So that's why people collect art.
Yeah.
If there's somebody who has a particular piece that they want so badly that they're going to commission its theft, it's more the stuff of Hollywood. It could happen, but we've never seen that happen yet.
Interesting. We did have one case here where we had a medical doctor, and he had it on the wall of his house, and it was I believe it was a Western artist named Remington that these junkies stole out of Omaha. But it was such a minor piece that he could show it to anybody, and they would say, "Oh, that's cool. You got a Remington. There's plenty of those around," and he could afford a real deal Remington anyhow, so it wasn't that big a deal.
And that's really what it comes down to is that art, high end art, does get stolen. It gets stolen quite often.
Yeah.
The art market is about $60 billion, and the FBI, we estimated about 6 to 8 billion of that is illicit, whether it's theft or fakes and forgeries. It's a tremendous market, but it's mostly second and third tier items.
Yeah.
Really valuable, well-known pieces. They do get stolen, but that's the easy part. The easy part is stealing it. The hard part is monetizing it. And that's why you very rarely see recidivism among art thieves, high-end art thieves, because you do it once and now you're stuck with the thing. It's easier to steal something else.
They got to go out and boost fur coats and stuff to make a living.
Yeah, exactly.
Do a jewelry store robbery down then, make a living.
And that's exactly the point. That's why you're seeing a sea change in terms of art thefts, museum thefts. The Louvre was a great example of that. Dresden Greenwald robbery, where 100 million euros in gems were stolen back in 2019.
Yeah.
Gems and jewelry, it can be broken down. It's going to
Yeah.
greatly diminish their value, but you can recut a gem. You can melt down the settings. You can monetize it for a greatly diminished value, but at least you can monetize it. And that's something you can't cut up a Rembrandt into smaller pieces.
No.
It's only valuable as a whole complete piece.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. We got a couple of guys, Jerry Scalise and Art Rachel in Chicago, flew to London, robbed a really valuable piece, the Lady Churchill's diamond or something, I don't remember, but really valuable piece, and mailed it to somebody on their way to the airport, and then got caught when they got back to Chicago and brought back to London and did 14 years in England, and they never gave up that piece, and nobody it never appeared anywhere, but it was just cut up, and they didn't make hardly any money off of it.
Yeah. Look,
Interesting.
there's much more profitable ways to
Yeah.
make an illicit living than stealing high-end artwork, but it does still get stolen. And that's one of the cruel ironies when you're talking about art theft is if somebody has a $20,000 piece of jewelry or a very expensive watch, they're most likely going to lock it up in a safe in their bedroom or something. But you have a $10 million piece of artwork. You probably got it on the mantle. You've got it over the fireplace or in the front foyer of your house, and probably doesn't have a passive alarm system protecting it or security screws to keep it from being taken off the wall because people want to show it off.
Yeah.
It's way too enticing.
Really. So, yes, you need to keep the word out there and keep this in people's minds. And I'm sure the museum tries to do this in some ways in order, hopefully, that maybe somebody will say, "Oh, I think I saw that somewhere in this news program or on this podcast." I'll put some pictures on the podcast when I end up editing this.
No, please do, Carrie. And that's the thing. That's the basis for the title of my book it really is a fugitive investigation. And that's how I work this case as fugitives and perfect fugitives because they're not like their human counterparts. They're not going to get caught, tripped up on the silly things that we need to do as human beings, getting a driver's license or whatnot.
Yeah.
Great. And so that's how I work the case. The FBI was really, I was always impressed with the FBI's support that they gave me on this investigation. We did billboard campaigns and social media blitzes and a lot of things to get these images out there to the public, hoping it might resonate with somebody. And that's really my goal for this book. I felt it should be written. I felt it's an important case. Certainly it's something that I wanted to write about. It's something that's very important to me. But it's yet another attempt to apprehend these fugitives. And I'm hopeful that it might resonate with somebody. Somebody's going to see something.
Yeah.
And there's so much disinformation and misinformation that's out there in the media about this case. People are endlessly all these armchair detectives, and I don't say it in a deprecating way. Good for them, and work as hard as you can. But if you want to work this case from your armchair, great. But you should be going off accurate information, because there's a lot of bad information that's out there on the internet. And if you want to help out, if you want to collect that $10 million reward, great. But you should be going off the most accurate factual information that's available.
Yeah, and you probably ought to go down in the deep, seamy underbelly of Philadelphia or Boston or somewhere and get involved with the mob, and then work your way up and make different cocaine deals and everything. And eventually you might be trusted enough that somebody'd say, oh, yeah, I've got those in his basement.
I would suggest there's better hobbies. That could be hazardous to your health. I wouldn't recommend.
Yes, it could. All right. Geoffrey Kelly. The book is 13 Perfect Fugitives. Those are the paintings that were stolen that you'll see on the podcast on the YouTube channel. The true story of the mob, murder, and the world's largest art heist. Geoffrey, thanks so much for coming on and tell us about this.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me.